Now to an Eyewitness News investigation into what's essentially becoming homeless encampments on wheels. So-called van lords are renting out RVs to people who are now using them as their permanent residence.
In 2026, living in an RV could become illegal in more American cities than ever before. Not because homelessness was solved, but because laws, enforcement budgets, and court rulings quietly changed. This isn't a theory. It's already happening, and the countdown has started. The year 2026 represents a critical convergence point where multiple enforcement timelines collide simultaneously. City ordinances, state mandates, federal funding requirements, and enforcement budgets are aligning toward stricter vehicle habitation control across the nation. Since 2020, over 150 U.S. cities have rewritten or proposed updates to parking, camping, and vehicle use laws, with most taking full effect between 2025 and 2026. Federal compliance drives much of this change. Cities receiving infrastructure, housing, or transportation grants must demonstrate public safety and right-of-way access standards. RV encampments increasingly violate these requirements. When compliance deadlines arrive, enforcement inevitably follows. Insurance and liability concerns accelerate the shift. Municipal risk assessments now classify long-term vehicle habitation as significant legal exposure. As lawsuits over fires, sanitation failures, and emergency access multiply, cities respond by tightening regulations rather than expanding services or support. At state levels, legislatures are redefining what qualifies as habitable vehicles. Narrower definitions eliminate protections RV dwellers previously relied upon. Once these definitions change, enforcement becomes legally permissible even without alternative housing options available. By 2026, temporary tolerance policies expire in dozens of cities. What replaces them are permanent enforcement codes with dedicated funding. The turning point isn't ideological or political, it's purely administrative. When laws update, budgets lock in, and compliance deadlines hit, RV homelessness transitions from tolerated to prohibited. The shift represents the moment when municipal systems stop accommodating vehicle dwelling entirely. For years, cities faced legal limitations on aggressively enforcing homelessness laws. Recent court decisions across multiple jurisdictions fundamentally changed that landscape. Courts clarified that municipalities may regulate sleeping, camping, or residing in vehicles, provided laws are written neutrally and tied to public space use rather than housing status. This distinction proves critically important. Instead of banning homelessness directly, cities now regulate specific behaviors: overnight occupancy, cooking activities, waste dumping, or remaining parked beyond posted time limits. These regulations apply regardless of housing status, making enforcement legally defensible against constitutional challenges. By 2024, legal reviews revealed that cities issuing citations under parking or vehicle codes faced 40 to 50% fewer successful lawsuits than those enforcing blanket homelessness bans. Consequently, enforcement strategies shifted rather than softened. Cities simply reframed their approach. The numbers reflect this change dramatically. Cities that reclassified RV habitation under parking enforcement increased citations by 30 to 60% within 2 years, while legal challenges declined proportionally. This shift gives municipalities confidence to expand enforcement aggressively. By 2026, most major metropolitan areas will rely primarily on vehicle code enforcement rather than homelessness statutes, making RV living legally risky even without explicit bans on dwelling in vehicles. The legal system didn't outlaw RV living directly. Instead, it made vehicle dwelling enforceable indirectly through existing municipal codes. And that distinction fundamentally changes everything for hundreds of thousands of people living in RVs nationwide. Anti-camping ordinances were originally written to address tent encampments and sidewalk dwelling. Over time, municipalities systematically broadened these definitions without significant public attention or debate. Terms like sleeping, lodging, habitation, and overnight occupancy were quietly added to existing codes. Once definitions expanded, RVs automatically fell under identical categories as tents and makeshift shelters. If a vehicle is used for sleeping, cooking, or storing personal belongings overnight, it legally qualifies as a campsite under revised municipal codes. By 2023, comprehensive audits revealed that over 60% of major U.S. cities had adopted language broad enough to include RVs under anti-camping regulations. Many residents didn't realize this legal reclassification until enforcement actions began appearing in their neighborhoods. This legal framing allows cities to bypass previous shelter availability requirements entirely. Municipalities are no longer required to prove adequate shelter access if violations are classified as illegal camping rather than homelessness. The distinction removes a significant barrier to enforcement. The expansion proves subtle, yet profoundly powerful. It transforms everyday survival activities into legal violations. Cooking inside an RV, sleeping overnight in a parked vehicle, or remaining stationary too long becomes prohibited behavior rather than a housing crisis issue. By 2026, most enforcement actions will not mention homelessness at all. Citations and removal orders will be framed exclusively as camping violations, even when the campsite has wheels, an engine, and valid registration. This semantic shift eliminates legal protections that previously limited municipal enforcement authority against people living in RVs. Parking regulations represent the fastest and legally safest enforcement tool municipalities possess. They're administrative in nature, carry minimal legal risk, and operate through already funded departments. Since 2021, cities increasingly target parking code revisions rather than controversial homelessness policies that generate public debate. Common regulatory changes include reducing overnight parking hours from 8 to 4 hours, limiting consecutive stays to 24 to 72 hours, enforcing strict curb clearance requirements, and adding vehicle length caps of 20 to 24 feet. These rules don't explicitly mention RVs, but they affect them disproportionately compared to standard passenger vehicles. Municipal budget data reveals parking-related enforcement spending rising 20 to 40%, while homelessness service budgets stagnate or decline. Parking enforcement generates substantial revenue through citations and towing contracts, making it financially attractive to cash-strapped city governments. Public pressure accelerates these changes. Complaints from neighborhood residents, business associations, and tourism boards drive rapid policy updates. Parking laws can be rewritten and implemented within 3 to 6 months, while housing solutions require years of planning and funding. By tightening parking regulations now, cities prepare comprehensive enforcement infrastructure for 2026 without generating significant public controversy or legal challenges. Enforcement becomes routine administrative procedure rather than emergency-based response. Parking law reform represents how municipalities normalize RV removal, quietly, legally, and efficiently. The approach avoids political debates about homelessness while achieving identical outcomes through technical code enforcement that appears neutral on its surface but eliminates vehicle dwelling systematically. One of the most effective tools cities employ to restrict RV living involves vehicle size regulations. By redefining which vehicles may legally park on public streets, municipalities eliminate RVs without mentioning habitation whatsoever. The approach appears completely neutral while achieving targeted results. Common regulatory thresholds include 22 feet, 24 feet, or weight limits exceeding standard passenger vehicles by 1,000 to 2,000 pounds. Once adopted, these restrictions instantly make most RVs illegal to park overnight anywhere except specifically designated zones, which often don't exist. Between 2019 and 2024, cities implementing length-based restrictions documented RV presence dropping 50 to 70%. However, this wasn't because people found housing solutions. They were forced into constant movement or pushed completely out of the area into neighboring jurisdictions. These regulations prove extremely difficult to challenge legally. Cities frame them as essential safety measures addressing visibility concerns, emergency vehicle access, and road surface wear. Courts routinely uphold such ordinances against constitutional challenges, giving municipalities confidence to expand their use. By 2026, 200 to 300 additional cities will likely adopt size-based parking rules because they're simple to implement, straightforward to enforce, and legally resilient against court challenges. For RV dwellers, these regulations remove any remaining ambiguity about legal parking. Vehicle size alone makes parking prohibited regardless of behavior or compliance attempts. This represents how RV homelessness becomes functionally illegal, not through one sweeping law, but through dozens of small, seemingly reasonable regulations that collectively leave no legal place to exist anywhere within city limits. Even as RV homelessness grows dramatically, legal parking capacity shrinks simultaneously. This fundamental imbalance explains why RV living becomes legally impossible. Since 2020, dozens of major cities removed thousands of curbside parking spaces through bike lane installations, bus-only corridors, outdoor dining expansions, and street redesign projects. Transportation departments report urban curb space declining 15 to 30% in dense cities over just 5 years. RVs, requiring longer stretches of flat, unobstructed space, face elimination first. Passenger vehicles adapt by using garages or compact spaces. RVs cannot. Simultaneously, population pressure intensifies. RV registrations for full-time dwelling increased 40 to 60% during recent housing displacement periods, while cities designated zero replacement parking spaces. The widening gap creates an impossible situation, exponentially more vehicles competing for dramatically fewer legal spaces. This imbalance creates constant violation risk, even for compliant RV dwellers actively trying to follow all regulations. A parking space that remained legal last year may become prohibited today through restriping projects or updated signage, often without advance notice to residents. By 2026, many cities will reach a breaking point where legal RV parking technically exists on paper, but not in practical, usable reality. When compliance becomes mathematically impossible due to space scarcity, enforcement becomes inevitable regardless of individual behavior or intent. The crisis isn't just about regulations becoming stricter. It's about legal parking disappearing entirely while vehicle-dwelling populations grow, creating an enforcement environment where violations become unavoidable even for those desperately attempting compliance. Enforcement doesn't begin with vehicle removal. It starts with escalating citations that create inescapable financial traps. Parking tickets for oversized vehicles or overnight occupancy typically range from $50 to $250 per incident. For people living paycheck to paycheck, repeat violations accumulate devastating costs rapidly. Many cities implement escalating fine structures. 3 citations within 30 to 60 days can exceed $1,000. For displaced individuals already struggling financially, paying fines competes directly with fuel costs, food expenses, and essential vehicle repairs. Non-payment triggers late fees adding 25 to 50%, registration holds, or arrest warrants. Once vehicle registration lapses, RVs become subject to immediate towing without additional notice. This represents where enforcement shifts from administrative inconvenience to catastrophic loss. The process operates legally, executes quickly, and proves nearly impossible to stop once initiated. The trap operates through simple mathematics. A person earning $2,000 to $2,500 monthly cannot absorb repeated $150 to $200 citations without falling behind on other essential expenses. Enforcement systems assume compliance remains possible, but shrinking legal parking options make violations completely unavoidable. By 2026, cities increasingly budget enforcement operations under self-funding models where citation revenue directly supports expanded towing contracts and cleanup operations. This creates institutional incentives to enforce aggressively rather than resolve underlying housing issues. Fines don't deter RV homelessness or encourage compliance. Instead, they accelerate financial collapse for people already operating at survival margins, pushing them from marginal stability into complete crisis within weeks or months of initial citations. Vehicle impoundment represents the moment RV homelessness becomes absolute and irreversible. When an RV is towed to impound, a person simultaneously loses shelter, transportation capability, and virtually all personal property. Recovery fees typically exceed $1,500 to $3,000 initially, then increase $50 to $150 daily, with accumulating storage costs. Most impounded RVs are never recovered by their owners. People simply cannot afford release fees that quickly surpass the vehicle's actual value. Vehicles get auctioned to salvage buyers or destroyed entirely. This process functionally mirrors formal eviction, but without tenant protections, mandatory notice periods, or legal defense opportunities. Cities increasingly deploy towing as their primary enforcement tool because it permanently resolves neighborhood visibility complaints. Once the vehicle disappears from that block, the immediate problem vanishes from community view, regardless of what happens to the displaced person afterward. From 2021 to 2024, cities that expanded towing authority reported 40 to 60% drops in RV presence within target neighborhoods. However, these same cities documented corresponding 30 to 50% increases in unsheltered street homelessness during identical timeframes. By 2026, impoundment will function as enforcement finality across hundreds of cities. Once towed, RV dwellers lose their last protective buffer between marginal housing and complete street homelessness. The process operates as one-way displacement. People don't recover their vehicles and return to stable situations. They lose everything and join street homeless populations immediately. Towing isn't enforcement. It's systematic displacement without the legal protections that govern traditional housing evictions. Historically, enforcement faced limitations when shelter capacity was demonstrably full. That protection is rapidly eroding nationwide. Cities now separate shelter availability from parking enforcement by reclassifying violations as vehicle code issues rather than homelessness-related offenses requiring alternative housing options. Shelter capacity remains dramatically inadequate across the country. Nationwide, available beds cover only 30 to 40% of displaced populations during typical conditions. Yet enforcement proceeds regardless of these capacity shortages. For RV dwellers specifically, shelters prove incompatible with their actual circumstances. Many facilities prohibit families from staying together, don't allow pets, or require surrendering personal possessions. Accepting shelter often means abandoning the RV entirely and losing essential employment access that depends on vehicle mobility. Legally, cities no longer need offering shelter availability before issuing parking citations or authorizing towing for vehicle code violations. This removes a major barrier that previously limited aggressive enforcement during winter months or crisis periods. By 2026, shelter scarcity will no longer slow or prevent RV enforcement actions across most major cities. The legal connection between shelter access and enforcement authority has been systematically severed through strategic code reclassification. Courts now routinely uphold enforcement even when shelter beds remain unavailable, provided the violations are framed as parking or vehicle code issues rather than criminalizing homelessness directly. This distinction allows cities to proceed with removal operations while avoiding constitutional challenges about cruel and unusual punishment. Shelter availability once protected RV dwellers from displacement. That protection has largely disappeared through administrative reclassification rather than increased shelter capacity. Beyond parking regulations, paperwork-based enforcement expands rapidly as cities coordinate with DMV databases, insurance verification systems, and code enforcement departments to identify non-compliant vehicles for immediate action. Expired registration, lapsed insurance coverage, failed emissions testing, or safety inspection violations trigger automatic citations or immediate vehicle removal. Many RV dwellers struggle maintaining compliance due to costs ranging from $500 to $1,500 annually, or mobility limitations preventing regular renewal. Insurance premiums for older RVs have risen 20 to 40% in recent years as carriers reassess risk profiles. Some insurers now refuse offering full-time dwelling coverage altogether. Without valid insurance, vehicles become illegal to operate or park on public streets, creating instant violation status. Registration renewal presents similar barriers. Fees for RVs typically run $200 to $600 annually depending on state and vehicle size. When combined with required insurance, emissions testing costing $50 to $100, and safety inspections adding another $100 to $200, total compliance costs exceed $1,000 to $2,000 yearly. Paperwork enforcement proves highly effective because it operates as binary determination. Either a vehicle maintains full compliance or it doesn't. There's no discretionary middle ground or grace period for financial hardship. By 2026, this enforcement layer will quietly eliminate tens of thousands of RVs from city streets without ever mentioning homelessness or displacement. Vehicles simply become illegal due to paperwork lapses, then face immediate towing. Administrative enforcement through documentation requirements achieves identical outcomes to explicit homelessness bans while appearing completely neutral and avoiding constitutional challenges entirely. Enforcement rarely affects populations equally or simultaneously. The first groups experiencing devastating impacts will be those least able to adapt. Seniors living on fixed incomes of $1,000 to $1,500 monthly, families with school-aged children, disabled individuals requiring medical equipment, and veterans managing chronic health conditions. Older RVs, typically 15 to 25 years old, are more likely failing safety inspections or emissions testing. Fixed retirement incomes cannot absorb sudden fines of $200 to $500 or insurance premium increases of 30 to 50%. Families cannot rotate parking locations endlessly without severely disrupting children's school attendance and parents' employment stability. These vulnerable groups also avoid traditional shelter systems due to legitimate safety concerns, health complications requiring privacy, or family separation policies that split parents from children. When enforcement escalates, they possess fewer fallback options than younger, single, able-bodied individuals. Data from cities that already implemented aggressive enforcement shows seniors and families displaced 6 to 12 months before broader populations experience similar impacts. By the time public attention focuses on the crisis, the most vulnerable have already been systematically removed. This pattern reveals how RV homelessness becomes functionally illegal in practice, not through simultaneous mass displacement, but by progressively removing the ability of the most fragile populations to remain legally present anywhere within city boundaries. Enforcement targets those least equipped to fight back legally, relocate quickly, or generate public sympathy through organized resistance. They disappear quietly before anyone notices the pattern developing systematically. RV parks are frequently suggested as obvious solutions, but basic mathematics make that completely impossible. The United States has approximately 16,000 RV parks total, with many being seasonal operations, privately owned facilities, or designed exclusively for short-term recreational use. Only 4,000 to 5,000 allow long-term residency at all. Capacity represents the fundamental problem. Even if every park opened gates to displaced people, available spaces couldn't accommodate 200,000 to 300,000 displaced RV dwellers nationwide. Vacancy rates in high-demand states like California, Oregon, and Washington sit near 0%, with waiting lists stretching 12 to 24 months. Cost creates another insurmountable barrier. Monthly rates that once averaged $400 to $600 now routinely exceed $1,000 to $2,500, often excluding electricity, costing $100 to $200, water, and sewer connections. For someone earning $15 to $20 hourly, that consumes 50 to 60% of gross income before taxes. Zoning regulations block expansion entirely. New RV park proposals face intense opposition from neighboring residents and planning boards. Consequently, total supply remains essentially flat, while demand explodes by 40 to 60% annually in crisis regions. RV parks were built for recreational travelers, not as permanent housing infrastructure. They cannot scale remotely fast enough to absorb a nationwide housing collapse affecting hundreds of thousands of people. Suggesting RV parks as solutions ignores mathematical reality. There simply aren't enough spaces, and expansion faces insurmountable political and financial obstacles in communities nationwide. As enforcement intensifies, displaced RV dwellers won't disappear. They'll relocate to neighboring jurisdictions, creating cascading interstate pressure. States with stricter enforcement laws effectively push RV populations into adjacent regions, overwhelming smaller cities and rural areas lacking infrastructure or resources to respond. This migration pattern is already measurable through vehicle registration data. Regions with lenient enforcement policies experience sudden spikes of 200 to 400% in vehicle habitation after nearby cities implement aggressive crackdowns. Local governments respond predictably by tightening their own laws within 6 to 12 months, creating devastating domino effects. The result transforms a local problem into a national crisis. RV homelessness becomes a moving emergency, bouncing between jurisdictions without any resolution. Displaced people exhaust savings constantly relocating every 30 to 90 days while searching for remaining tolerance zones. By 2026, more states will coordinate enforcement strategies specifically designed to close escape routes between cities. Interstate compacts and information sharing agreements will eliminate geographic flexibility, one of the last survival tools available to RV dwellers. Recent examples show this coordination emerging. When 5 to 7 cities in a metropolitan region simultaneously tighten regulations, displaced populations have nowhere to relocate within 50 to 100 miles. They're forced into constant motion across state lines or pushed into complete street homelessness. Migration doesn't solve homelessness, it redistributes displacement until no jurisdiction remains willing or able to absorb incoming populations. The crisis becomes permanent, mobile, and nationwide rather than locally manageable through any policy intervention. Making RV living illegal doesn't eliminate homelessness. It transforms its visible form dramatically. When RVs are removed through towing, escalating fines, or comprehensive parking bans, displaced people don't transition into stable housing. They lose protective shelter first, then join street homeless populations immediately. Data from cities' increasing RV enforcement reveals consistent patterns. Vehicle removal is followed by 30 to 50% increases in unsheltered street homelessness, not declines. RVs provide critical insulation from weather, secure storage for possessions and documents, and essential mobility for employment access. Even under unstable conditions, they protect people from extreme temperatures, theft, and constant exposure to violence. Once an RV is impounded or forced from an area, those protections vanish instantly. People transition to sidewalks, tent encampments, or doorways, locations far more visible, dangerous, and expensive for cities to manage. This displacement increases municipal costs dramatically. Emergency room visits rise 40 to 60%. Police calls for disturbances increase 25 to 40%. Sanitation and cleanup budgets expand by hundreds of thousands of dollars. Cities spending $2,000 to $3,000 to tow one RV often spend $10,000 to $15,000 annually managing the resulting street homelessness. Ironically, enforcement aimed at cleaning up neighborhoods typically produces more visible homelessness. RV living functions as a critical buffer between housed life and street survival. Removing that buffer accelerates collapse into deeper crisis, rather than promoting stability or housing transitions. Criminalizing RV living doesn't solve anything. It removes the last protective layer before people hit the pavement completely. Homelessness caused by structural. Housing shortages cannot be solved through enforcement, because enforcement doesn't create housing units. The United States faces a deficit of 4 to 7 million affordable housing units, with construction timelines stretching 5 to 10 years behind accelerating demand. No amount of citations, towing operations, or arrests can close that fundamental gap. Every enforcement action treats homelessness as voluntary behavior rather than economic condition. But comprehensive data proves otherwise. When rent exceeds 50 to 60% of income, displacement becomes mathematically inevitable. When wages lag 30 to 40% behind housing costs, people fall out of the system regardless of compliance efforts or personal responsibility. Cities increasing enforcement often document temporary reductions in RV visibility, but never reductions in actual homelessness. Displaced populations are pushed elsewhere, forced into constant relocation, or driven into deeper instability in street living. Enforcement changes location and visibility, not underlying outcomes or housing status. A financial contradiction undermines enforcement strategies. Cities spend $50 to $100 million annually on enforcement, towing contracts, and cleanup operations, while affordable housing development remains chronically underfunded at 10 to 20% of necessary investment levels. The cycle consumes massive resources without addressing root causes. By 2026, enforcement-heavy strategies will reach practical limits. When every city within 100 to 200 miles tightens rules simultaneously, displacement has nowhere to go. At that point, homelessness becomes unavoidable and unmanageable rather than controlled through geographic shuffling. This crisis cannot be enforced away because it wasn't caused by rule breaking. It resulted from structural housing system failure requiring structural solutions. If current trends continue uninterrupted, 2026 will mark the moment RV homelessness shifts from tolerated to systematically criminalized across most of the nation. Not through one sweeping federal law, but through thousands of coordinated local regulations that collectively leave no legal place to exist anywhere. This critical moment will define whether the United States addresses housing collapse structurally through investment and construction, or manages displacement purely through punishment, enforcement, and geographic redistribution without resolution. Cities will spend billions on enforcement while homelessness continues growing 15 to 25% annually. The approach treats symptoms while ignoring causes, creating cycles of displacement costing 3 to 5 times more than permanent housing solutions while achieving worse outcomes for everyone involved. RV homelessness becoming functionally illegal nationwide won't end the crisis. It represents the point where displacement outpaces compassion entirely, and enforcement replaces problem-solving as default policy response across hundreds of jurisdictions simultaneously. What emerges after 2026 depends entirely on whether housing gets rebuilt at scale or whether basic survival itself remains classified as continuous violation requiring constant punishment and removal. The choice isn't between enforcement and chaos. It's between addressing housing failure structurally or managing human displacement through increasingly expensive, ineffective punishment systems that solve nothing while costing exponentially more than building actual housing. 2026 represents decision time. Invest in solutions or institutionalize punishment as permanent policy response to housing system collapse affecting millions of Americans nationwide. When survival itself becomes illegal, the system hasn't failed. It's turned against people. If RV living or enforcement has already hit your city, share what you're seeing in the comments. And in our next video, we expose what actually happens after RVs are banned and where people are pushed next.